Hello, so today I'm joined by Jamie Holroyd, and Jamie is a performer, guitarist, educator, and author based in the north of England. Jamie specialises in jazz guitar, and today I'm going to be having a bit of a chat with him about his work in jazz education and kind of various aspects of his online tuition, his Patreon page, podcast, YouTube, everything he does basically. So, first of all, just want to say, Jamie, thanks so much, mate. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I think it'll be a really valuable resource for other tutors. So thank you and hello. So we'll just kick off straight away. Just say, Jamie, could you give us a bit of a sort of brief background about your, how you got to sort of where you are, what you do, and just where the interest in jazz guitar came from, and talk a bit about that perhaps.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm Jamie. I'm a guitar teacher. I've been playing jazz guitar, nothing but jazz guitar properly for kind of like the last 11 or 12 years, really. And basically, I started getting into jazz around the time I went to study at Leeds College of Music, and I've got a degree in jazz from there and a diploma. And basically, yeah, it was. I was at the point where I was really into blues, like many jazz guitar players were. I really enjoyed playing blues music, and I had this kind of choice to make between doing popular music and doing jazz. And of course, I was young and naive at the time, so I made the choice of doing jazz rather than popular music. So I suppose you live with your regrets. But after doing that, basically, I got really interested in jazz guitar, and since graduating with a degree in jazz, I've been basically making a full-time living as a musician, mostly from teaching and occasionally doing a bit of playing as well. In terms of teaching, I've had all kinds of different teaching businesses over the years, both in person. I've taught at school, had my own room, gone to people's houses, done peri gigs. So I've got a wealth of experience doing that. And I've also got a wealth of experience doing lots of online things, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about more about. And in terms of performing, I suppose that I've been very fortunate in that I played with a ton of great UK jazz musicians, and I played at jazz festivals and jazz clubs across the UK, and I played even in the USA a few times, thanks to the things that I do online. Mainly that's been the main kind of pathway into getting into that. But of course, the most recent highlights of gigs include back-to-back performances in the living room for the last year, occasionally in the upstairs room to the audience of the partner and the dog. So I suppose that's what's been going on recently, like many of us musicians have been facing that same kind of scenario.
Cool, great. That's a great place to start. I mean, talking about the jazz side of it, what's I think quite interesting about what you do is that you're obviously, as you just said, a specialist in what you do. Jazz guitar is your thing. I think that, talking with a lot of other tutors, it's something that a lot of other tutors are quite keen to move into in various guises, whatever. So I think I'd just like to know, first of all, I think you've kind of answered it, but how did you, becoming a specialist was it a conscious decision? You're like, right, I'm going to just teach jazz guitar. It kind of just ended up being that way. I mean, I think, as I said, you kind of answered it, but and maybe just on top of that, any tips for people who want to specialize a bit more in a particular area of teaching, whatever genre that might be?
Well, thanks. That's a really great question, and it's interesting because I guess my preference has changed, because when I first started doing online lessons, some of my early lessons were actually blues guitar lessons as well as jazz. So I did a few of them. And today I have a YouTube channel, and my most popular video on YouTube has 500,000 views, and it's a blues guitar lick, which I did really quickly in one take. I wouldn't recommend that anyone goes and watch that because it's from a couple of years ago, and it's certainly not something that I'm tremendously proud of now. But anyway, that ended up getting 500,000 views. But of course, the focus, as you know, went towards jazz guitar, really. And I think that certainly for any of the guitar teachers wanting to get into online guitar teaching and that type of thing, I think that there's quite a lot of YouTube lessons teaching us how to play Sweet Home Alabama. There's quite a lot of them already out there, and I think that that's not to say that would be impossible to succeed with that, but I think niching down these days, I think is a really good idea. And it's, for me personally, at the time it was because that's what I wanted to do. Like, I do teach general guitar, and I do like regular bands that many guitar teachers will like, but I'm going to be doing this as a hobby in my free time and talking about things and writing down things, then I want to be talking about things that I'm really interested in, that I'm passionate about, and that I feel that I've got maybe a unique perspective on that. And of course, from doing that, it's also from going at that point rather than like a financial angle or something like that. It's obviously providing me with a few interesting opportunities over the years, obviously performance opportunities, and even some of the students that I've taught online have been really interesting and surprising, and a very different clientele from what I might expect teaching in person. For example, I've had a lot of international students, people in America, people in Europe, and funny enough, a couple of years ago, the guitarist from the Baby Shambles got in touch with me, and he wanted to do some jazz lessons, and he ended up doing a jazz diploma out of all people. So,
Really?
yes, you never know what's going to happen.
Cool. Blimey. Wow, there you go. That's really cool. Yeah. I think, sort of following the passion side of it, and just not, like you say, that point, there's a lot of lessons on how to play Sweet Home Alabama, and people are looking for something more nuanced than that, I suppose. So, great.
I think you've got to kind of just experiment a little bit as well. I think that, sometimes you've got to be honest with yourself, and sometimes be willing to realize that some things that you actually might not want to talk about are always going to be so popular. So sometimes you've got to do a little bit of a mix. You've got to kind of look at the results and think, okay, these are things that I would find interesting and that my students might find even interesting in person, but sometimes online they might not be so interested, and you've got to kind of adapt to that and constantly look at things. I suppose that some people might be really successful talking about gear, some people might be really successful talking about specific guitar players, and of course these are the interesting things about, I think, for me, online lessons, because there's some YouTube channels and things that focus just like on specific guitar players, and of course in a private teaching studio you're never going to have 50 weekly students that are going to want to learn about Stevie Ray Vaughan or something like that, but online that's certainly a possible scenario.
Interesting. Really good. I think it's an encouraging thing to hear that for other tutors, that actually there is, because a lot of people just assume it's like you cast your net as wide as possible and you just do everything, but no, it's cool to hear your insight.
And I've been in both boats as well. When I first graduated, I was kind of the guy that's like, do you want some piano lessons? I can teach a little bit of piano. I can do ukulele, and just obviously to try and make ends meet when you're a student and things. These are things you do, but obviously the online side of things has obviously given me a great opportunity in which I can kind of narrow down and focus on what I really want to do. So I think that for most guitar players and guitar teachers, it's something that I'd highly recommend just doing and giving it a go, to be honest with you. I think that anyone can do it. If I can do it, then certainly anybody else can do it.
Yeah, cool. Well, cool, mate. That's great. Thank you. I mean, so moving on to you've written a lot of created a lot of ebook content on your website, which obviously, I mean, having had a sort of brief look, it must take, obviously, aside from the fact that it must take absolutely hours to compile the stuff and put it together. I'm sort of interested, and I think hopefully other people would be, in just the more sort of technical side of it. So when you've compiled the material, which takes hours, do you get somebody proofread it? Do you get a designer in? Does somebody convert it into an ebook for you? Then, from a technical point of view, how do you actually sell it? I mean, I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but paper and so just a little bit about how that works from a technical point of view for you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that certainly any guitar teacher that's interested in this should check it out. And it can seem, like you said, extremely overwhelming in the beginning, because you might be thinking, well, do I just kind of sit there with a blank sheet of paper and do I just begin writing, and then do you get the finished product? But thankfully, I've developed the process over a number of years. It used to be initially kind of like that, and it used to be quite difficult. But initially, I suppose it's like when you first start teaching guitar, it can become like kind of challenging to get really great results. I'm sure I can certainly be honest and say that my first guitar lessons, I don't think I was a tremendously fantastic teacher in the very first few that I did, but over time you just refine the process and you refine your lessons, and that's what I've done with these. So what I do is that I try to write down as many resources as I go along throughout teaching, and obviously since even before the last year I've been doing lessons online, I was really big into just making sure that I had like PDFs and things like that available, of jazz resources and things. So really, when it comes to doing an ebook, I will already have a lot of like etudes and diagrams and things already there, which makes it tremendously easy for me. I mean, when I first started, it was much more difficult, but as you get going with it, then you realize that you can often develop, if like I use Sibelius, for example, and
Right.
most of the guitar teachers might use something like Guitar Pro. Once you've got those resources, you can kind of develop them and tweak them for other things as well, which becomes easier. So I would say that, for example, like my last ebook, which I released at the time of this recording, was a guide about playing a jazz standard called Autumn Leaves. And
Right.
I think that took me less than a month to compile together. And I just had bits of resources that I gathered together over the years. Of course, I did have to put some fresh things in there as well and edit it, like you said. So it's not that much of a time-consuming process. And probably one massive point which I'll mention for any guitar teacher that's interested is a big mistake which I did initially. My first few ebooks were like massive. They were like 100 and over 100 pages, 110, 120 pages or something like that. And the statistics are that not many people actually work their way through many ebooks that they buy. You know, many people might just, and of course, you know, if you think about it from the consumer perspective, if you buy an ebook and you just learn like 2 or 3 licks or something like that, then you could get the value from that. If you just learn 2 things, then that could be worth the value of the book for you. So certainly focusing on a shorter ebook length would definitely was a massive opening point for me. And in terms of the editing and the proofreading, you're absolutely right. I think it definitely is worth checking out maybe a proofreader or an editor. I mean, for me, I'm lucky that my partner is really good at that type of thing. So I can usually just convince her if I buy her a nice dinner to have a look through it and do that. But of course, things like Fiverr exist, which they're a fantastic service, and you could usually get a good editor off there for a low price. And things like ebook covers, basically I had a friend, funny enough, a student in America that designed my ebook cover for me. And of course I did pay him to do that, and I basically just tweaked that for the different ebooks that I do. But once again, there's some really good options that guitar teachers can use, like Fiverr, or there's an online website called canva.com, which is a tremendous. Yeah, I'm sure you know about it as well. I use it for like YouTube thumbnails, but there's usually like really good book templates, and I have no experience with Photoshop or anything like that. And you can usually put something together that looks, you know, mildly presentable at the very least with just half an hour on Canvas. So that's a good way about doing that.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's just so great these days that, I mean, all those things you highlight. I mean, it's just everything you're sort of talking about. I think a lot of other people are sort of sitting there thinking, oh yeah, actually, you know, because it's all stuff that's, like you said, Canva. I mean, I just perked up when you said Canva because it's just unbelievably good. I don't know, you know, but yeah, just interesting that there's so much you can do now completely by yourself. That's a cool thing, I suppose, really, isn't it? You know, it's great to have that. So no, that's
absolutely
great.
And I suppose from a technical point as well, one thing that I should point out is that literally all the ebooks that I've written have been done on Microsoft Word. There's nothing funny there. There's nothing complex. Obviously, the selling point is having, I think, clear musical examples. So basically, like I said, I just write my examples in Sibelius. Most guitar players have Guitar Pro, Sibelius, Power Tab, Songster, something like that. And I just get nice, clear pictures in them, and I make sure that they're nice and clear on the page. But other than that, I think that I try and make sure that things are well written and that the images are clear, and it's usually quite a simple process. And like I said, if you are a guitar teacher that's been teaching at least 1 or 2 years, I'm sure that you've probably got some sheets together. And basically the main thing to remember with an ebook or a course is that I think that people like to pay for structure, and I think that people are happy to do that if they can pay for something that's like, you know, an Autumn Leaf study guide, and they've just got everything in one place, audio examples, a clear path as to what basically the steps that they need to take is, then that is something that people are happy to get, even if, like, for example, for me as well, some of the things, some of the sections from my ebook, I might talk about them in a YouTube video or a podcast or a blog. I don't ever do the entire thing, but I think that that's an important thing to do as well online. You've got to realize that by nature of just talking about, especially a niche thing, as we've already said, you're probably going to overlap on some subjects, and you're going to have to reuse some of your things. You might use one lesson for a YouTube video, and then a couple of years might pass, and you might think, oh, I could really do that a whole lot more justice than what I did a couple of years ago. And then you might kind of do it again for a book, and then a couple of years you might talk about it in a podcast. So And that's what I found. I suppose you might find that as well, that in your private teaching, once you've been doing it a couple of years, you know, you find that the same handful of songs tend to be popular, that everyone needs to know these chords, and that there's a certain kind of set number of things that are there. And you think, actually, I'm just kind of refining my process to do this. Like, you know, I'm sure that every guitar teacher has a different stance on teaching open chords, and obviously you develop your personal way of doing that, and then that's basically it. You just kind of, it's one thing that you keep developing and that you can reuse. So I think that once you break it down, and most guitar teachers see that, you know, the ebooks and the courses are really just kind of collections of private lesson notes and ideas, and my own teaching evolving over time, I think it becomes a much less daunting process. And
that's good.
I think that most guitar teachers can do it, providing you give yourself a deadline. I think that's really important. As well. If you're going to do this, don't just say like, I'm gonna write an ebook sometime in 2021. You need to try and maybe give yourself a 2-3 month deadline or something like that, or else it just never happens.
Yeah, of course, I can imagine. No, it's great. I like what we said about sort of people keen to pay for structure, and actually, you know, if I think about, you know, if you're learning a tune, actually, if you've got a really in-depth sort of thing on that tune, that's great. You've kind of done it for me, you know, in a way, sort of thing. So I think that's a really key point. And then what you say, that, I mean, essentially all guitar teachers have probably got a load of notes lying about their hard drive somewhere anyway. And sometimes it's just a case of compiling them. But that's great. It's, hopefully that's inspired some people to take the initiative, really.
It's why people pay us, isn't it, for guitar lessons? If someone, I suppose, you know, we can't be oblivious to the fact that you can go on YouTube and you can type in, you know, beginner guitar lessons, free lessons, but, you know, guitar teachers, despite all the kind of revolutionary things that are happening with technology, most of us are still doing okay, and people still want to book lessons for us, and that's because they want someone to tell them what to do in the best way possible to make the most use of the time.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. So then sort of for me, it moves on to your Patreon page, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I sort of, you know, look at it, feels like that was a natural progression from your YouTube chat. You know, you built an audience, and then the kind of Patreon was the next thing on from that. So, I mean, just for people who don't know what it is, could you talk a little bit, just briefly, what is Patreon, you know, and why does it work for you? And again, you know, just for other people who feel that they're at a stage where that might be something they'd be interested in doing, what sort of, you know, tips would you give for people who are perhaps keen to get involved with something like Patreon for their teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Patreon is basically, the best way to describe it, I suppose, is almost like a membership site that you might get to a website, but it's almost kind of like halfway between that and a structured way of getting donations for the work that you do online, basically. So I suppose that's the best way I can think of describing it. But I suppose in terms of what people get who might support my Patreon, it's basically, I do the lessons on YouTube, which are free for everyone to watch. And the Patreon page is basically a way of giving those a few extra things. Like, for example, I have a few exclusive video lessons, which everyone gets. I have 3 different tiers, and these tiers are not to be confused with any other type of tiers. They're just basically Patreon tiers. And there's one level where you pay $1 for every video which I post. There's another level which you pay $3 for every video which I post, and then there's another level which you pay $10 for a video which I post. And basically the $1 submission means that you just support what I do, which is greatly appreciated. And then the next one is a $3 submission, and for that they get like downloadable PDFs, they get choice of the topics which I create videos about, they get other exclusive things like that, a lot of preference and a lot of insight into what I do. And then the last one, basically they get feedback from me about maybe some of the assignments which are included in the bonus PDF material. So that one is not quite as popular as the middle one. The $3 one, where people get the PDF, tends to be the most popular option, basically. And I started mine, I think it was in June or July of last year. And around a year ago, next month it will be a year ago, obviously, as I'm sure you know, Charlie, a lot of musicians took on live streaming, and you probably go on Facebook or YouTube and everyone was live streaming. Of course, I was absolutely no different in that respect. And, you know, I was a little bit skeptical and probably a little bit nervous about kind of giving it a go. I'd never done it before, but I thought, you know, what the heck, we've got all this time, let's try and do something with it. So I basically gave that a go, and to my surprise, it went pretty well. You know, the first few live streams that I did had really good participation, and people were sending donations and things like that. And I thought, oh, that's good. There could be something in this. And really, beyond that point, I mean, sorry, before that point, I hadn't really taken my YouTube channel that seriously. To be honest with you, I just kind of, you know, did videos here and there, didn't really kind of take it as a serious thing, believe it or not. And around that time, I thought, right, I'm going to start taking this seriously now. I'm going to try and do one video every single week, regardless, and just put something out there. And of course, by doing that, I started upgrading the production value of the videos, using microphones and cameras and things like that. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this and I want to not be relying upon YouTube to support what I'm doing, because YouTube is like different now compared to what it used to be. All social media is different compared to what it used to be. A couple of years ago, you used to have something called organic reach on Facebook, and that would really favor those using social media trying to develop a business. But now it's a much kind of trickier thing to crack. So for me, the Patreon was a way of thinking, okay, I can do this, because these videos take time. Even if, as I'm sure you know, even if it's a 15-minute video, you've got to plan it, you've got to edit it, you've got to, some people even like to script it, and you've got to distribute it and upload it to YouTube. And there's a lot of steps to doing a video. I'm sure that most videos probably take at least a couple of hours to do, even if they're only 10 minutes on the video. So I just thought to myself, if I can do this, and if I can get some kind of, if people want me to do this and they're willing to support my time in doing this, and I'm happy to do it. And I think that from a guitar teaching perspective, I think it's a really good way to offer a different service besides just doing the one-to-ones. Because if you think about it, one-to-ones are great, and I'm sure that, you know, like me, you've probably had really good results as a one-to-one teacher over the years. But at the same time, obviously, it's a big commitment for some people to make, obviously, both financially and in terms of time. And I think that if they can kind of commit themselves to something which is not as much money, and something that they can commit to that way, then that works really well for some people. And since launching that in June or July, I've been fortunate enough to build up a nice community of different players there who ask me things, and it's been a really positive experience so far. Of course, there are a few cons as well, which I can talk about if you like. I wouldn't want to give a, you know, like a rose tinted glasses perspective of this. I'd like to give everyone a full disclosure of what some of the cons are, because they really surprised me when I got into this, and they weren't what I thought they were.
So what sort of drawbacks do you see with something like that then? I mean, they, you know, to give the broader view, I mean, if provided you're happy to mention them, you know.
Of course, absolutely, because I couldn't find anything on this. So the first thing is that the donations on Patreon, you can actually see, if you can have a setting, and it will allow you to basically show what amount of pledges you get each month. So I think that mine at the time of this, I can't remember how much it is actually. I think it's around $100, I want to say, something like that. But basically, that is not always what you get, because once someone pledges to a Patreon, they don't always have to pledge the full amount. So say in comparison to like a membership site or something like that, then obviously there is no fee negotiation. You know, once you get a bill for something like even a private lesson, they have to pay that. So not everyone has to pay the full amount every single week. That's one thing. Another thing that was surprising is that Patreon does charge platform fees, which for me, and these might increase or decrease based on the size of your following and things, but for me, the platforming fees I think are about $30 every month, and there's also a $30 transfer fee. So at the end of every month, basically, I get my pledges transferred to my PayPal account, and they charge me $30 for that as well. So you know, that's definitely a con. I suppose the flip side to that is obviously it's quite easy and convenient to set up, unlike something like a membership site. I basically did mine in one afternoon, and obviously for me the pros do outweigh the cons, but that's certainly one financial con to that, which is not as transparent initially as at least it wasn't to me. And a second, probably a slight con to Patreon, is that it's quite hard to structure some of the material sometimes, because basically you're just kind of posting videos, and you can, you know, make some, you can have a go at structuring it, but you can't, like, it's not like say a website or even an ebook or something where you can really structure the contents. You basically, when you sign up to support someone, you're just scrolling down and you're just kind of going through things that way. So I think that if you can work through things yourself, then it might be a bit easier, or if you just want to get a brief tip here and there, then there is that to it. But it's certainly not as structured. I haven't found as like a full video course or an ebook or something like that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, just with the Patreon thing, just generally, that I think a lot of people, I think having an audience with this whole online thing that, I mean, broadly that we're talking about, having the audience in the first place is such a huge thing that a content creator or tutor needs. And I suppose, I mean, I'm sort of asking, I suppose, you know, if you hadn't had the audience that you'd sort of worked to get, how easy, I mean, this is, you know, but, you know, would you have been able to get the interest on Patreon or sell the ebooks? I think for me, that core sort of gaining an audience is probably what people need to think about first. I mean, do you feel that way, or is it different? I don't know.
You're completely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, for me, basically, my Patreon I don't think it would have succeeded whatsoever had I not built something called a mailing list, which I suppose is another kind of subtopic, but just to kind of give everyone that's interested a brief overview in this. If you're a guitar teacher that's interested in getting into anything online whatsoever, then you want to make sure that you prioritize a mailing list over anything, because say, for example, even if you did YouTube and you started getting very successful at YouTube, they can change whatever laws or the way an algorithm works like that, and basically that can completely, you know, really favor what they show of yours. And it basically would mean that if I existed without a website or a mailing list, then I wouldn't be very comfortable with that. So for me, even though we're obviously focusing on these type of things, for me, the YouTube and the Patreon, that's pretty much like, I'd say one video is about 1 day's worth of work for me. So that's where it's at. It's like out of my entire working week, it's not a massive priority in terms of all the other things. It's just one section of the pie that kind of the infrastructure of my business. So yeah, the following and the reason why that succeeded, I think, and the reason that my ebooks sell and people book lessons with me, I think these things definitely help. You know, obviously YouTube, I'm not saying that they don't help at all, but maybe my Patreon following, or it'll probably be about a quarter of the size of where it is now, had it not been for my mailing list supporters. So that's a really important point to consider, because I know some of the amazing guitar teachers and friends of mine that have done it, and they're fairly new to YouTube and things like that, and they haven't, like you said, built as much traction yet, and they found it a little bit more tricky to get going. And it's really just, you know, they just need to build that following first. And I'll probably say that, I mean, if you're a guitar teacher and interested in doing this, I suppose there's no harm in maybe doing a Patreon page from the get-go, but you probably want to, I'd probably recommend trying to get a bit of steam and a bit of traction first, and just really discover what works, rather than kind of going in with the sole purpose of making money. Of course, everyone's different. You know, who's to say a guitar teacher won't release a video tomorrow and it would be, you know, more popular than, you know, what most of us would do. So there's not like a math to success with it. I think it's just a lot of trial and error, and bearing in mind those things that I've said.
Yeah, great. No, very interesting. I think that's sort of really important, rather than just sort of steaming into it. You know, the mailing list thing, like you say, is huge, and that's actually a really important thing. This whole online thing, like you say, being in control of your own audience rather than YouTube dictating to you how many views you get, you know, whatever. I mean, that again, you know, smoothly brings me on to ask about your podcast, which I actually had a listen to over the weekend. I honestly thought it's really, really great. I've got keen interest in jazz guitar anyway, and just, you know, concise to the point. I listen to loads of podcasts, and some of them are music related, some of them aren't, and there's just a lot of waffle. But yeah, really cool. Anyway, what I was going to ask is, you know, just talk a little bit about why and sort of how that came about, and a little bit about the process maybe. And, you know, if you've got, what sort of other things have you got planned for the podcast sort of moving forward for the next year or so? Just talk a little bit about that maybe.
Well, thanks very much, Chad. I'm glad that you listened to it and that you enjoyed it. Well, basically, I have the face made for radio, so podcasting the natural. But I was just like many other people. I was kind of researching how people distribute lessons and media over the course of the last year, and I've never done a podcast before, so it's very early days for me. I've only kind of launched this a month or two ago, and I'm not really pushing it too hard. But at the time I created mine, I couldn't find any jazz guitar podcasts. I thought, that's interesting. There could either be a reason for that, or it could be perhaps a slight window of opportunity. So I thought, well, I'm just going to do it and see what happens. But so far, the feedback has been very, very positive, thankfully, and it seems to be going quite well. So I think it's just a different experience. I really like podcasts myself, like yourself. I like to listen to a lot of podcasts, and there's some that I really enjoy listening to. From a production value, it's certainly much easier for someone to do a podcast than what it is a YouTube video, you know, especially as guitar teachers. There's pros and cons to it. Obviously, being a guitar teacher, some might say it's a very visual instrument, so you want to have, you know, visual diagrams of people's fingers and hands and things. But there's obviously ways in which you can get around that as well. Like, for example, some of my podcasts I have on my website, and I have like some chord charts and some etudes that do support the podcast material as well. And for me, it was basically, before that, I used to do a lot of blogs back when blogging was a bit more popular, but they were hugely time consuming. And basically, as time went on, it turned out that those took more time than videos and podcasts. And now I think that if you look at where things are going, it tends to be that videos are becoming the most popular way in which people absorb content and learn things. And podcasts are basically kind of up and rising again. So I thought, it'd be worth taking a punt, because there weren't any jazz guitar podcasts at the time. So that's what I did. And I think it's a different relationship. I think that when you go on YouTube, for example, I'm sure that like me and many others, we're all guilty of going for one thing, and then we get distracted and we go down a rabbit hole. And, you know, even we might go to find out about a guitar lesson, and then we're watching videos of cats or something like that 20 minutes later, and we've gone completely astray. And of course, the nature of YouTube is kind of designed for that, you know, to keep you on as long as possible with all these kind of catchy titles and fancy thumbnails and things. Whereas a podcast, people might listen to your podcast when they're doing housework, when they're going for a jog or something like that, and they tend to listen to it all the way through, which is tremendously important, because on YouTube, on my analytics, you can actually check out how long people watch your videos for, and most people rarely do they watch more than 50-60% of a video, whereas a podcast, people will listen to it for much longer. So that's an interesting statistic. So basically where I'm going with it, as you were asking, it's trial and error at the minute. I'm just kind of trying out different content and seeing what goes on. I would like to do kind of like this and more interviews in the future. That would be an interesting thing to do as well. But basically, there's a lot of trial and error, and I think that's a good thing. As I was saying earlier, if you do a YouTube channel, if you do a podcast, if you do a Patreon page, although it may seem like, you know, I've succeeded with some things like a Patreon page or a YouTube page, there's plenty that I've failed on as well. I can sit here and just give you, for everything that's gone right, I can give you this list of things that have gone wrong to get to the point that's correct. So for me, it's still very much trial and error at the minute, but I'm greatly enjoying doing them.
Great, that's brilliant. They're very interesting, and I guess better audience retention that's another interesting point. But that's certainly a good thing. So that's great. I was going to ask about the playing side of things, which, you know, obviously at the moment there's nothing going on, but when we are able to do gigs again, which we will, you know, are there any sort of live recording projects, anything you just want to mention that you're going to have coming up, even though we're sort of having to plan into the future? Is there anything you got sort of going on that you wanted to mention?
Well, at the minute, there's nothing set in stone, probably for the reasons that we all know about. Of course, before this all happened, I was meant to be playing at a few jazz festivals in the summer, and I was looking at doing some more international playing again, but obviously all that kind of got put on hold. But certainly the positive side to that is many musicians have been doing live streaming, and since I've been getting into recording and streaming and things like that, one thing I would like to do when things do get back to normal is to focus more on the live stream side of things. I really enjoy the potential of that, because usually organizing things like tours and festivals and gigs and things like that, it's great fun, and it's certainly, you know, like a ritual of passage for any serious musician to go through. But at the same time, I'm really excited to check out some of this live stream stuff as well. I've got a space at the side of the house, and I'd like to invite 1 or 2 musicians over and start doing some things there. And I would certainly like to get playing again in that way and check out what that has to offer. But certainly nothing in concrete yet, and that'll be another thing that is trial and error, I'm sure.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well, hopefully we're all able to do it live. But yeah, the live stream thing's very interesting. It's another angle, I suppose. You have to adapt a bit, don't you? I suppose, really. But yeah, okay. Well, look,
I suppose, being from a jazz perspective, we're used to not having much of an audience anyway. So playing for no applause afterwards, or one or two people, is perfectly fine for us.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Maybe it will, have a resurgence in jazz, and it will suddenly be as popular as pop music or whatever they call it these days. So yeah, look, I think that's kind of what we're going to cover today. I mean, but honestly, it's been really great. I mean, just some great insights and just practical information for guitar teachers that's actually applicable for everybody, which I think is really useful. So thank you very much. I mean, just best place to go to find out about you, Jamie. Where can we go right now to find out about podcasts, YouTube, Patreon? Just your website, I suppose.
I'll probably just say my website, which is jamieholroydguitar.com, and my podcast is on there, and all the other information you might need to find about me, you can find on my website.
Okay, and podcast will be on all the main providers, is it? Kind of, because there's a load of different platforms.
That's right. Yeah, at the minute it's on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts are the free ones, and of course you can listen to that on my website as well. No one does, but the option is there.
Yeah, of course. Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll obviously link to all the stuff sort of below, and make sure we've got lots of links out. But yes, I'll just close and say thank you very much, Jamie. It's been awesome, really great to catch up, and nice to do it. We didn't even get to talk about guitars, unfortunately, so maybe we'll have to do it again. Whole new episode about vintage gear and stuff. Anyway,
absolutely.
But yes, thank you very much, mate. Nice to chat, and catch up soon. Cheers.
Cheers, Charlie. Thanks for having me. Great to be on this interview.
No worries, man.